I thought I was dying. Lucky for you all, I didn't. But what if I did? What would happen to my wife and my kids? But even more, what would happen to me? Every set of beliefs has an answer to those questions. Questions about life, death, and what happens after both. I found myself asking these questions, holding tightly to the answers that I knew to be true one night in my mid-20s. I still don't know what kind of sickness I had, but I wasn't going into septic shock like I tried to convince my wife that I was. I'm maybe a bit of a hypochondriac. It's a funny story to tell now because I was absolutely not dying, nor on the brink of death. But my experience felt like I was on the brink. As I lay in my bed, heaps of blankets on top of me, my body manically switching from hot to cold, sweat and shivers. I was in a kind of liminal space, in between reality and what I perceived to be my impending end, between this life and the next. Much that is strange and unexplained happens in these liminal spaces. And it was just this kind of space that the unsuspecting Dr. Ross found himself in the first time he entered a sweat lodge. Welcome to the Sword and Staff Revenant. I'm your host, Coleman Barber. I'm an elder at Proclaim Church in Bonner Springs, Kansas, and this is our next installment of Pagan America, where we take a look at how the beliefs and practices of those who've inhabited the lands we now call the United States have shaped our people, cultures, and lands. Today, we're going to be talking about a sweat lodge. But before we get into that, let's talk about who this Dr. Ross is. In his book, Mitakuye Oyasin, Alan C. Ross, later known as Ahanamani, describes his upbringing as part of the Dakota Nation, more commonly known as the Sioux. Ross was born of mixed heritage, the blood of the Santee, Sikangu, Ponca, as well as the Irish and Scottish coursing through his veins. Growing up on the reservations, Ross received a Christian education. Now this might sound a bit out of place to some, but those who know anything about reservations or any other colonization efforts need to understand that this is actually pretty common. I'm not an expert here on this, so I'm not saying that this is absolutely the norm or this is normal on every reservation, but it is common practice of Christian, or maybe you prefer the term Christianized cultures, to provide schools, maybe even for free, for the children of this new territory to attend. Typically, they were some form of Christian school specifically. The first time I encountered this, for myself at least, was when my Indian proper, not Native American, but my Indian coworkers started talking about watching Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ in school growing up. Apparently, in India, you went to the Christian boarding school in order to get a good education if your parents could not afford to pay for one. Here were the remnants of the British Empire in the form of Christian schools. And all my Indian coworkers apparently knew the Catholic Church calendar better than this white Protestant guy from Kansas. It was really bizarre to have this realization. And according to Dr. Ross, his education on the reservation was much like this. He describes his time on the reservation as strictly Christian and Western. So much so that when he was serving a military tour in Germany, he discovered a club that studied the American Indians. He says, quote, "To my surprise, I learned that the German knew more about the history of the Dakota or Lakota people than I did." End quote. Ashamed, he decided to learn his history and culture in earnest. At first, he did what any one of us does when our interest is piqued. He read books. Well, I guess that's what we all did before the internet. After that, he started talking to the older folks, asking them to tell him what they remembered when they were young. And before we get too much further, I want to encourage you, if you haven't talked to old people, you should do it. Just like this. There's nothing quite like hearing someone describe their own experience of events. My kids ask me about 9/11 like we asked our parents about Korea or Vietnam. I can remember talking to my great-grandpa about standing in line for gas rations during the World Wars, and even wilder, he would tell us stories from his childhood of talking to men who were alive during the Civil War. History is fascinating, and our own personal history is much richer and stranger than we might think. And so it was with Dr. Ross. What initially started as a simple investigation into his own culture grew into a desire to participate in that culture. He had not to this point embodied the spiritual expressions of the Lakota. He simply began to participate in seemingly benign things like powwows, that's ritual dancing, as a dancer or a singer or announcer or some other part. And this is often how these kinds of things start. A vague interest in the occult, some kind of pull to rediscover one's heritage. Someone begins to understand what they did, but perhaps doesn't understand or doesn't fully understand the why behind it. It is not until the why begins to manifest that the mask begins to slip. For some, what lies behind the mask they regard with a kind of reverence. For others, a simple curiosity, seemingly innocent, they pursue more for the sake of understanding, but ultimately, they are consumed. When I was growing up, my sister and I would play childish games like any other set of kids. Sometimes that would involve joking around like we were speaking in other languages, wild dances and the like. And oftentimes, this would come with a quick retort from our mother. "You shouldn't be doing that. You don't know what you might be saying or doing." I've grown to realize the wisdom of my mom in a lot of those quips over the years. She somehow always knew something, and as I read the account of Dr. Ross, I kept thinking to myself, he really needed a mom sitting there and saying, "You shouldn't be doing that. You don't know what you might be saying or doing." Because ultimately that's right. He didn't know what he was doing or saying. Sure, he may have known what the words he was singing said. He may have known all the dance moves that he was performing, but what he didn't realize was that he was participating in something. And I use this word participating in a way that I hope is consistent with the idea of participation that I've already outlined in other episodes and interviews. The idea here is that the things we do in the body, the material, have effects on the spiritual, the unseen. Perhaps it's as simple as participation in a culture, and doing so endears you to it. You become more comfortable with the customs, the ways of speech, the phrasing of certain things, and all of this begins to form you as a person. But that formative process is not some happenstance psychological side effect. It's the way that the world works. Participation and practices are always formative, with the greatest form of participation being the kind that is informed and full of intent. An example, in one of the old episodes of Sword and Staff, pre-Revenant that is, the hosts read an occultic liturgy, and they received some pushback and complaint that this was foolish and that they were performing the liturgy itself. Yet, how the liturgy is performed is important as well. First, this wasn't performed as all the other elements, they weren't present, so they weren't really performing the liturgy for one. But secondly, the intent was not to call forth any forces of darkness. Rather, it was actually intended to mock them. And this matters. One can be ignorant and participate in something accidentally, and one can be informed and participate in something intentionally. I think that one can also be informed and participate against something intentionally, which is what was happening in the old sword and staff episode. In any sense, by inverting the occultic liturgy as a mockery, it was simply that, a mockery. And we see something similar to this in Scripture as well in 1 Samuel 17 and the fight between David and Goliath. There's a sort of liturgy of war happening, if you will. Like the great heroes of the Iliad, there's a call to settle the contest of two armies, not by battle among the many, but by a test of champions. We may not see this as liturgical or some sort of participation in ritual, but here are two cultures very clearly ordered, not simply on vague concepts of national sovereignty, but on the worship and claim to greatness of their respective gods. Hey everyone, thank you again for listening to Sword and Staff Remnant. And if you're enjoying this episode, or if you've been enjoying the other episodes as well, then we'd love for you to leave a review, leave a like, leave a comment. If you're listening and you haven't checked out our YouTube channel, you can actually watch these there. And most of the time I've got some sort of visual element. And for our interviews, I actually have the video of the interview. So if you want to know what I look like or what other people look like that I'm talking to, then you can do that. With an exception, our next episode is going to be with the anonymous white owl. So you won't see what he looks like, but you'll want to stay tuned for that one as well. If you enjoy the information that we're talking about this season, any of the content, and you want more information about those things, there's always links in the description. There's links to our Discord there as well. We'd love for you to jump in on the conversation. There's also links to any books that we discuss. Those are Amazon affiliate links, so if you order through that link, then I do get a little bit of a kickback that helps me with things like production costs and things like that. So love for you to participate however you can. And now it's back to the show. But here are two cultures very clearly ordered, not simply on vague concepts of national sovereignty, but on the worship and claim to greatness of their respective gods. Whoever wins the battle here says as much about their god as it does the champions themselves. So keeping that in mind, Israel finds themselves facing a Philistine army who has sent out a champion, who happens to be a giant. And yes, that kind of giant, like dirty deeds done angelically kind of giant. When David goes out to meet the giant, he does so boldly with 5 stones and a sling, one for Goliath, and I think implied here, one for each of Goliath's 4 giant brothers. Goliath sees David prepared to battle a giant, not with sword, spear, armor, or anything, but a sling and a belief that God would prevail. And this is what happens. Quote, "And the Philistine said to David, 'Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?' And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, 'Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field.'" End quote. 1 Samuel 17, 43 through 44. And here, there is a bit of a call and response thing that happens. This is the pre-battle ritual, if you will. Goliath sees him and thinks he has it made. But the question then in this ritual is, how will David respond? Quote, "Then David said to the Philistine, 'You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. End quote. 1 Samuel 17, 45 through 47. See, David doesn't say, oh, let me come up with 5 reasons why you shouldn't listen to threats from giants, or start strategizing about how to get rid of birds in order to keep the scenario described from happening. No, he says, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to cut off your head, and the birds will eat you instead. And it's our God who will do it. The curses of the Philistine gods don't matter. And that's what we can do in regard to participation as Christians. There are limits, though. It's not like I'm saying that there is a Christian way to use a Ouija board or something. There most certainly isn't. But there is a way to mock the practice for what it is. That is, grasping at straws for a little drop of the power that Yahweh actually has. But that's not usually what happens. Like I started to say earlier, people get interested. They want a little taste of something they deem as real. So they do things like Dr. Ross. You just start by doing the dances. You sing the songs. You listen to the music. You hang out with the people. Next thing you know, you start to believe things you never thought you would, and you just don't know how it happened. Fast forward a few years with Dr. Ross. He's married now to a nice Native American lady and teaching Native American studies at a local college. He starts to have a condition in his foot and decides to go to a doctor. That's what you do when you have a problem in your body, right? You just go to the doctor. Well, after several rounds of medications and tests, the doctors finally told him that there was nothing they could do. They could give him medicine to dull the pain he was having, but nothing was going to fix his problem that he had. It was simply a mystery to them. However, after much consideration along with his wife, Ross decided to try something he'd never tried before: a sweat lodge. Ross and his wife set off for South Dakota, where they would meet up with a holy man named Dawson No Horse. Dawson received an offering of a sacred pipe filled with tobacco, just like a good Presbyterian would, from Ross and his wife. The offerings had to be tied in little pouches of red cloth, which the Ross family stayed up late that night doing. And when it came time to perform the healing ceremony, Dawson was wrapped up in a star quilt in a ceremony house or a sweat lodge. Windows covered, singers singing, drummers drumming. I want to quote Ross at length here. Quote, "It was the first time I had heard these songs. I was used to hearing powwow songs, but these songs were different. I could sense they were spiritual songs, the way one tells the difference between sacred and secular music. The spirits came in. When the singing started, they were flying around. You could see them. They looked like sparks of light. You could hear them too. They sounded like wings flapping in the dark. A spirit came in and stood in front of where I was sitting. He put his hands on my head." End quote. He notes from there that as he prayed with the hands of the spirit on his head, there were flashes of light like a ring or a circle that were happening inside of his head. And then the singers sang another set of songs, and the spirits left. They went home. After a time, it was clear that the healing had worked. Ross explains that in order to pay thanks to the spirits, he chose to perform a sun dance that went on for days, and it nearly killed him. So, why this story? Well, I mean, first of all, it's pretty wild. Some will likely, and many already have, dismissed this experience and those like it as some sort of sweat and heat-fueled fever dream that has more to do with dehydration and hallucination than communing with spirits. But it would seem that things like bodily extremes can cause people to see things in a different light. Whether it's Ross in a sweat lodge, or me being very sick though not dying, or even Christ after 40 days of fasting in the desert, when pushed into those extreme spaces, weird things happen. And there is no reason from a Christian perspective to automatically assume that there is nothing spiritual or significant about the things that happen in them. This is why it's important to look at a story like Ross. Over time and participation in unfamiliar but seemingly innocent ritual, and not in the mocking sense we talked about already, this little participation inevitably leads to greater participation, and with intent. And the rest of his book is riddled with the evidence of this. Things which I do intend to get into, but for this edition, I simply want to use this story as an illustration and a warning before we get going. Because there are those out there, some who claim the title of Christian, who willingly dabble, who would say that certain rituals, practices, etc. are meaningless for them, so why worry about the dabbling? But how is this fundamentally any different than the atheistic Satanists who performed a black mass at the Kansas Capitol building last week? It doesn't take much time or research to see that even though they claim atheism, they are, by the willing participation in certain practices, becoming more and more like their own namesake. And for Christians, we need to understand this too. In the United States, we live in a land full of mystery. There is a temptation to be drawn into the truly beautiful aspects of Native American cultures. There's an appeal to the way they tend to seek harmony with nature rather than use it. There are myths with common threads and themes that seemingly point to Christ, the true myth. We talked about one on our last episode. And then there are sweat lodges, healing ceremonies, and spirits who require offerings and manifest in circular lights that you see in your mind. There's room for healthy interest, seeking common ground, and finally, knowing the enemy, but participation is always treacherous. A counter-participation in a Davidic sense is only appropriate because he knew that he was in a battle. As we continue this season to look at some of the practices that have shaped the land we live in, keep these things in mind. Do not be swayed to participate in evil. In the words of John, and we know that the Son of God has come and has given us understanding so that we may know him who is true, and we are in him who is true, in his Son, Jesus Christ. He is the true God and eternal life. Little children, keep yourselves from idols. 1 John 5:20-21. Thank you for listening to the Sword and Staff Revenant. Stay tethered, everyone.